James Madison once said that if people were angels, we would have no use for law. My work in legal philosophy and moral philosophy shows that James Madison wasn't right about this. Of course, we need law and government to address a variety of human moral failings, but even morally very good people would need law and government to get along well together. My program has two sides. One side of my research program is concerned with specific legal institutions that facilitate or hinder citizens having good moral relationships with each other. This includes some work on democratic theory as well as some work on healthcare justice. The other side of my program, which I'd like to say a little bit more about, concerns the relationship between law and law enforcement. If you believe, as Madison did, that the only point to law is addressing human misbehavior, then you'll probably think that law has no point unless there are sanctions attached to legal prohibitions. On this view, there's no point to telling people to do something, or the government telling people to do something, unless the order is backed up with the threat to lawbreakers to put them in prison, to fine them, to compel payment of damages, or something of that nature. I argue that law can serve morally important purposes even when it's unenforced or underenforced. Law can be morally binding on us, quite apart from the effect that any sanctions have. Here's an example. Consider an income tax law that's either entirely unenforced or underenforced. Of course, underenforcement is the situation that we're in because there are some forms of income that aren't subject to third-party withholding or reporting. And the IRS estimates that in 2006, I believe it's 54% of people who owe tax on amounts that are not subject to third-party reporting or withholding do misrepresent the amount that they're owing. That's a lot of people cheating on their taxes, but it's also a lot of people who are paying their taxes honestly, even though there isn't a reliable enforcement mechanism to sanction them if they don't. So I focused on the ethical question here. If you're in this situation, you have income that you could conceal from the IRS or another tax authority. And if you know that roughly half of your fellow citizens are shirking the tax and roughly half are paying it honestly, what's your moral obligation? Well, tax laws serve a morally important purpose. They attempt to organize support for morally important public goods, such as public safety, and to do it in a fair way. Of course, if some people aren't paying their assigned share, that's unfair. But you would be compounding the unfairness or the injustice if you chose to join their number. It would be unjust free riding not to pay your fair share. The right thing to do is to report your income honestly and pay the tax. So this is an illustration of a general principle. Often there's a moral obligation to obey laws that are unenforced or underenforced. And this is important partly because there's sometimes good reasons not to enforce a law. For example, there might be resource limitations on the part of law enforcement, or there may be privacy considerations. It might be impossible to enforce a law effectively without an undue intrusion. Two key points. First, for citizens and residents, there can be a moral obligation to follow laws that are unenforced or underenforced. Just because you could get away with breaking the law doesn't mean you're entitled to morally. This is going to apply when there's no enforcement on the books at all, when there are sanctions on the books but they're rarely applied. It'll also apply when there are sanctions on the books that are applied but they're too slight to affect behavior by themselves. The other major takeaways for legislators. Sometimes legislators have reason to believe that a law that's being proposed couldn't be enforced both efficiently and fairly. That alone shouldn't take a proposal off the table. Sometimes the right thing for a legislature to do is to enact a new law, demands that citizens take that law seriously, but not back that demand up with a threat of sanctions. This argument is going to be relevant to business people who are facing difficult questions about whether to follow an under-enforced law when following that law might not be narrowly in the firm's interest. Here's a not-so-hypothetical example. Suppose that there is a labor law requiring overtime pay for certain categories of workers. And let's suppose that this law is under-enforced because the only liability is back pay plus interest. An employer that is narrowly self-interested might choose simply not to pay the overtime because the sanctions on the books aren't enough to effectively deter non-payment. There may nonetheless be a moral obligation to pay overtime pay, given the importance of this law in a fair scheme of economic cooperation. My arguments are going to have particular application in the international context. Sometimes a multinational business is doing business in a lower middle income country where law enforcement has resource limitations and prevents them from enforcing all of the socially important laws effectively. I argue that the moral obligation to follow socially important laws isn't limited to the laws of one's own country. One can also have a moral obligation to follow socially important laws when one's doing business as a visitor. On this side of my research program, I have three directions that I'd like to explore. First, I'd like to look more closely at the effects, if any, of competition on what obligations businesses have to obey unenforced or under-enforced laws. Are there situations in which a very tightly competitive market makes it genuinely infeasible to obey an under-enforced law? And if so, could the moral obligation to support morally important legal institutions be fulfilled by participating in some kind of institution building instead? That's one future direction. Another is to look at what forms of enforcement are appropriate in a business context. In particular, I plan to look at general moral principles that apply to the use of force and see what they have to say about when imprisonment is an appropriate penalty for white-collar crimes or for nonviolent property crimes more generally. Last, I'd like to look more closely at the international context, and in particular at the question, what should a business do, a multinational business do, if it has reason to believe that some of its business partners in a resource-poor settings are breaking the law, perhaps because the law isn't effectively enforced, perhaps because law enforcement has resource limitations. Here's a relevant example. In 2013, there was a terrible building collapse in Bangladesh. An 8-story building collapsed, killing over 1,000 people and injuring over 2,500 more. And the building collapsed because it wasn't up to code. If they'd followed the local building codes, which were under-enforced, the people wouldn't have died. Part of that building was being used as a garment factory that manufactured garments for export. So I'd like to look at the question, what obligations does a multinational fast fashion corporation have when it has reason to believe that its business partners in low and middle income countries may not be following some important laws, including safety codes?